Was William Gilbert truly the father of electricity? Or was he merely a learned physician dabbling in curious experiments with magnets and amber? This question has haunted the corridors of scientific history for centuries. Some textbooks crown him as the pioneer of electricity and magnetism, the man who first dared to declare that the earth itself was a gigantic magnet. Others dismiss him as a transitional figure, important, yes, but overshadowed by those who came later. Franklin with his lightning, Faraday with his coils, and Maxwell with his equations. To understand Gilbert is to step into an England caught between two worlds. The year is 1600. Queen Elizabeth I sits upon the throne, her court filled with intrigue, poetry, and exploration. Across the seas, sailors armed with simple compasses risk their lives in the age of discovery. The cosmos is changing too. Copernicus has already placed the sun at the center of the universe, Galileo is pointing his telescope toward the heavens, and Kepler is calculating the paths of planets with mathematical precision. It is an era of bold claims and dangerous ideas. And in the midst of this intellectual and political tempest stands William Gilbert of Colchester, a quiet but brilliant physician, a scholar of Cambridge, a man of medicine who nevertheless dared to wrestle with one of nature's deepest mysteries. The hidden forces that move the needle of a compass, attract iron, and seem to hum invisibly beneath the skin of the world. Gilbert's greatest work, De Magnete, was not merely a book, it was a declaration of scientific independence. Unlike the philosophers of old who relied on Aristotle's authority or medieval scholastics who clung to dogma, Gilbert experimented. He rubbed amber, he carved lodestones into spheres, he floated needles on water, and he observed. In doing so, he left behind speculation and stepped boldly into a new method, empirical science. Yet, one might ask, was Gilbert's work truly about electricity at all? After all, he studied magnetism more deeply than he studied the faint sparks produced by rubbing glass or amber. The word electricity itself he borrowed from the Greek electron, meaning amber, but his understanding of it was embryonic, no more than a curiosity compared to his vast exploration of magnetism. Can we then call him the father of electricity, when Franklin's kite, Volta's pile, and Faraday's dynamo still lay centuries ahead? Or should we honor him instead as the first man to separate electricity from magnetism, to give them each their own identity, their own place in science? Perhaps the answer lies not in the inventions that Gilbert produced, but in the path he forged. He was not an inventor in the sense of Edison, nor a revolutionary like Tesla. He was something rarer, a trailblazer who changed the very way humanity approached invisible forces. He asked the right questions at the right time. He dared to test, to doubt, and to record. Without Gilbert, the language of electricity may never have entered the scientific lexicon, and the magnetic nature of Earth might have remained an enigma for generations longer. This script will take us on a journey through the life and times of William Gilbert, physician, courtier, philosopher, and experimenter. We will walk with him through the narrow streets of Colchester, where he was born in 1544, trace his education at Cambridge, follow him into the royal court, where he served as physician to Queen Elizabeth I, and finally witness his scientific triumphs and untimely death in the shadow of plague. Along the way, we will uncover not only the facts of his career, but also the atmosphere of an age in which science was still dangerous, uncertain, and wondrous. We will ask difficult questions. Was he a genius ahead of his time, or simply a bridge between medieval speculation and modern physics? Did his insights genuinely pave the way for Franklin, Volta, and Faraday, or have later historians exaggerated his role? And most importantly, what does it mean to be a pioneer? As you embark on this exploration, imagine yourself standing in a candlelit chamber, surrounded by instruments of brass and glass. Before you lies a polished sphere of lodestone, smooth, heavy, mysterious. A needle hovers nearby, trembling, pointing north with invisible certainty. The physician-philosopher leans close, his eyes alight with curiosity, and whispers words that will echo across centuries. The earth itself is a great magnet. From this moment begins our story. The story of William Gilbert begins in Colchester, one of the oldest towns in England, known in Roman times as Camulodunum. By the mid-16th century, Colchester was a bustling market town, alive with the sounds of wool merchants, artisans, and farmers who brought their goods to its narrow streets. It was here, on May 24, 1544, that William Gilbert first entered the world. His family was neither noble nor destitute. The Gilberts belonged to the respectable middle ranks of English society, people with enough means to provide education, but not so highborn as to be insulated from work or responsibility. William's father, Jerome Gilbert, was a local figure of some standing, and his mother, Elizabeth Coggeshall, came from another established Essex family. The union gave young William not only stability, but also a heritage rooted deeply in the civic life of Colchester. Growing up, Gilbert would have witnessed a town in transformation. England under Henry VIII had broken with the Catholic Church only a decade earlier, and the Reformation was still reshaping daily life. Monasteries had been dissolved, new parish structures were emerging, and the very rhythm of faith and society was in flux. In Colchester, these changes were especially visible, for the town had long been a religious center with important abbeys and churches. To a boy like William, the contrast between the grandeur of the past and the uncertainty of the present must have been vivid. From an early age, William demonstrated curiosity and discipline. Surrounded by the medieval remnants of Colchester's Roman walls, he likely roamed the ruins and countryside, absorbing both history and nature. It is tempting to imagine him fascinated by simple phenomena, iron nails clinging to lodestones sold by traveling merchants, or the mysterious pull of a compass needle that sailors used in nearby ports. While these childhood encounters cannot be documented with certainty, they provide a fitting image of a boy destined to unravel the secrets of invisible forces. Education was the key to advancement in Tudor England, and the Gilberts recognized William's talents early. He was sent to the Colchester Royal Grammar School, a place that would have introduced him to Latin, rhetoric, arithmetic, and the rudiments of natural philosophy. In those classrooms, illuminated by slanting daylight through small windows, he encountered the works of Aristotle and Galen classics that had dominated European thought for centuries. Teachers encouraged memorization and debate, instilling in Gilbert both discipline and a taste for intellectual challenge. But Colchester was not only a place of books, it was a town alive with commerce and seafaring. Essex lay close to the North Sea, and sailors passed through with tales of voyages to distant lands. The 1542nd and 1552nd were decades of intense maritime ambition. Explorers like Sebastian Cabot and later Francis Drake were expanding England's horizons. Compasses, charts, and navigation were discussed as matters of life and death. For a young student, the knowledge that invisible forces guided ships across oceans may have left an indelible impression. By the time William approached adolescence, England itself was in turmoil. The succession crises of Edward VI, Mary I, and eventually Elizabeth I shaped the nation's destiny. In Colchester, townsfolk debated religion, politics, and trade, while plague outbreaks occasionally darkened the streets. Such uncertainty forged resilience in Gilbert's generation. He learned early that stability was fragile, that truth could be contested, and that survival required adaptability, a lesson that would later inform his scientific method of questioning rather than accepting authority blindly. In 1558, when Gilbert was 14, Elizabeth I ascended the throne. The Elizabethan era would define his adult life. With it came a new age of cultural flowering, Shakespeare was beginning his career, poetry thrived, and the sciences slowly emerged from medieval shadow. For young William, the promise of opportunity beckoned. His grammar school education had prepared him for greater things, and soon he would depart Colchester for Cambridge University, the intellectual heart of England. This chapter of his life closed with the image of a bright young man leaving behind the medieval streets of his hometown, carrying books and ambitions, ready to enter a world where faith, reason, and discovery collided. He left Colchester not as a famous scientist, but as a scholar in training, poised to encounter the ideas and challenges that would shape his destiny. When William Gilbert arrived at Cambridge University in the early 1562, he entered not only a school, but a crucible of transformation. Cambridge was one of England's two great universities, rivaled only by Oxford, and it stood at the intersection of tradition and change. Medieval scholasticism still echoed in its lecture halls, yet the new winds of Renaissance humanism and Reformation thought blew through its cloisters. For a young man from Colchester, Cambridge was both intimidating and exhilarating a place where the life of the mind was tested in the company of ambitious peers. Gilbert enrolled at St. John's College, one of the largest and most vibrant colleges of the university. Founded in 1511, St. John's had quickly established itself as a center for rigorous learning. Its stone courts and chapels echoed with the footsteps of scholars in black gowns, while its libraries held manuscripts and printed books that were still considered rare treasures. Within these walls, Gilbert immersed himself in the study of the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, the traditional foundation of higher education. But Cambridge in the 1562 was not a static place. The Protestant Reformation had shaken the intellectual order, and scholars debated fiercely over theology and philosophy. Aristotle's works, long the cornerstone of European thought, were still taught, but increasingly challenged. Humanist scholars promoted the study of classical languages and texts in their original forms, encouraging students to compare, to question, to interpret. Gilbert was educated in this atmosphere of questioning authority, a habit that would later become the very essence of his scientific method. Life at St. John's was disciplined and structured. Days began with prayers in the college chapel, followed by lectures, disputations, and private study. Tutors demanded precision in Latin, for it was the universal language of scholarship. Gilbert would have read Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid for eloquence, Euclid for mathematics, and Ptolemy for astronomy. The medical texts of Galen and Hippocrates were also present, sowing the seeds of his later career in medicine. A central exercise at Cambridge was the disputation. Students debated in Latin on philosophical and logical problems, sometimes to absurd extremes. For Gilbert, these debates honed not only his rhetoric, but also his ability to analyze, to separate assertion from proof. Though the subjects might have been scholastic, the method taught him clarity of thought and argument skills he would apply to magnets and electricity decades later. In 1561, Gilbert earned his Bachelor of Arts, marking the first milestone of his academic path. But he did not stop there. Driven by ambition and curiosity, he continued toward the Master of Arts, which he obtained in 1564. This progression reflected not only diligence, but also a deepening commitment to scholarship. Cambridge had transformed him from a provincial youth into a learned man, equipped with the intellectual tools to pursue greater questions. It was during these years that Gilbert first encountered the writings of the ancient natural philosophers. Aristotle's physics and meteorology were staples, but he also read Pliny, Lucretius, and possibly fragments of early Greek thinkers like Thales and Anaximander. These men had speculated on the nature of the cosmos, the elements, and the forces that bound them. Though their explanations were often flawed, their curiosity resonated with Gilbert. He began to sense that beyond theology and rhetoric lay a world governed by hidden principles waiting to be uncovered. Equally important were the influences of Renaissance humanism. Thinkers like Erasmus and Copernicus had already reshaped Europe's intellectual landscape. Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, 1543, had proposed a heliocentric universe, an idea radical and dangerous, but impossible to ignore. At Cambridge, Gilbert would have heard murmurs of these new cosmologies. He may not have fully embraced them yet, but the seed was planted. Authority could be wrong. Observation could reveal truths greater than tradition. Another crucial path opened to Gilbert at Cambridge, the study of medicine. In an age when physicians were rare and prestigious, the choice promised not only intellectual fulfillment, but also social advancement. Medical education was still rooted in Galen's ancient teachings, emphasizing the four humors and balance in the body. Yet, even here, cracks were forming. The works of Vesalius, who had published his revolutionary De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543, challenged traditional anatomy by insisting on direct dissection and observation. Gilbert absorbed this spirit of looking for himself rather than trusting received wisdom. By the late 1562, Gilbert had become not only a master of arts, but a candidate for medicine. His studies would eventually lead him to a Doctor of Medicine degree in 1569, cementing his career as a physician. But his medical training also did something subtler. It reinforced his respect for the body as a system governed by natural forces, an insight that would later inform his approach to the invisible forces of magnetism and electricity. Cambridge was more than its curriculum. It was a living network of scholars, debates, and ambitions. Gilbert studied alongside men who would later shape Elizabethan England in politics, literature, and science. The libraries gave him access to the latest printed books from the continent, carried by merchants and scholars across the Channel. He may have read about experiments with lodestones in obscure European texts, planting the curiosity that would later define his life. At the same time, he lived a disciplined, almost monastic existence. Students at Cambridge were expected to wear gowns, attend services, and obey strict college rules. Nights were spent in study by candlelight, in rooms cold and sparse by modern standards. Yet this rigor instilled in Gilbert the habits of observation, patience, and persistence qualities that would serve him well in his later experiments. By 1569, Gilbert left Cambridge not as a philosopher lost in abstract speculation, but as a trained physician and scholar with the tools to investigate nature. He had mastered Latin, debated the ancients, studied mathematics and astronomy, and embraced the humanist spirit of inquiry. More importantly, he carried with him the conviction that knowledge must be tested, not merely inherited. Thus ended Gilbert's formative years at Cambridge. The boy from Colchester had been remade into a man of learning, prepared for the dual life that awaited him, service as a physician to England's elite, and a parallel pursuit of secrets hidden within the earth and sky. His next journey would take him into the world of medicine and the royal court, where his reputation as a healer would grow even as his mind turned restlessly toward deeper mysteries. By the time William Gilbert completed his Doctor of Medicine degree in 1569, he stood poised at the threshold of two worlds, the rigorous profession of healing and the restless curiosity of scientific exploration. Medicine was not merely an occupation in Elizabethan England. It was a pathway to prestige, influence, and access to the very heart of power, the royal court. For Gilbert, it was also a discipline that demanded observation, diagnosis, and experiment skills that would later spill over into his inquiries into magnetism and electricity. After Cambridge, Gilbert settled in London, the throbbing heart of Elizabethan England. The city was a paradox. It was both a place of glittering opportunity and lurking danger. Its narrow streets were crowded with merchants, actors, poets, and sailors returning from voyages that spanned the globe. Taverns hummed with stories of the New World, while playhouses echoed with the voices of Shakespeare and Marlowe. Yet plague also stalked the alleys, striking down thousands with terrifying speed. For a physician, London was both laboratory and battlefield. Gilbert treated fevers, wounds, and the mysterious sweating sickness that baffled doctors of the age. He applied the knowledge of Galen and Hippocrates, balancing humors with herbs, diets, and occasional bloodletting. But unlike many of his peers, Gilbert insisted on careful observation. He watched how illnesses spread, how patients responded, how environment shaped health. This empiricism, rare in his day, made him respected and sought after. Word of Gilbert's skill traveled quickly. He was not merely a healer of bodies, but also a man of intellect, conversant in philosophy and the latest scientific ideas. His Cambridge training had given him polish, and his manner impressed both patients and colleagues. By the 1572nd and 1582nd, he had built a reputation as one of London's most reliable physicians. He served wealthy merchants, influential nobles, and eventually attracted the attention of the court itself. In 1600, his career reached its pinnacle when he was appointed physician to Queen Elizabeth I. To serve the Virgin Queen was no small honor. Elizabeth's court was a dazzling yet treacherous world, filled with intrigue, rivalries, and constant scrutiny. As royal physician, Gilbert entered the intimate circle of those entrusted with the monarch's health, a role that required both medical skill and political delicacy. At court, Gilbert's duties ranged from treating Elizabeth's ailments to advising on matters of health and disease prevention. Physicians of the era were expected not only to heal, but also to counsel, blending medicine with diplomacy. Gilbert navigated this environment with care, never overstepping but earning trust through competence. The Queen herself valued learning, and it is possible that Gilbert shared with her some of his ideas about nature. Elizabeth encouraged scholarship and patronized explorers, poets, and thinkers. In such an atmosphere, Gilbert found space not only to practice medicine, but to nurture his scientific pursuits. The court provided him with connections, patronage, and a degree of protection for his intellectual endeavors. What set Gilbert apart was his refusal to separate his medical training from his curiosity about natural forces. He saw parallels between the balance of humors in the body and the hidden harmonies of the earth. Just as a physician sought patterns in symptoms, so Gilbert sought patterns in the movements of compasses and lodestones. The habits of diagnosis and experiment translated naturally into the habits of scientific inquiry. His medical career also gave him credibility. In an age when natural philosophers were often dismissed as dreamers or alchemists, Gilbert's standing as a respected physician lent authority to his research. He was not a wandering mystic. He was a man of science, trusted by England's queen. The Elizabethan era was one of curiosity and bold experimentation. Sailors brought back exotic plants, minerals, and tales of strange phenomena. Alchemists searched for the philosopher's stone, astrologers cast horoscopes, and natural philosophers debated the nature of the cosmos. In this vibrant climate, Gilbert began his experiments with lodestones and amber. The court may have whispered about his strange pursuits, but his reputation shielded him. Unlike more radical figures who faced censure, Gilbert was free to experiment, to write, and to publish. It is tempting to imagine Gilbert in the company of navigators and explorers who frequented Elizabeth's court. Figures like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh relied on the compass for their daring voyages. For them, magnetism was not an abstract curiosity, but a matter of survival. Gilbert's studies, therefore, had practical resonance. His exploration of the earth as a giant magnet directly linked to navigation, making his science not only bold but useful. By the 1592nd, Gilbert lived a dual existence. By day he was physician to London's elite and to the Queen herself. By night he turned to his laboratory filled with lodestones, compasses, and strange experiments. He moved effortlessly between the world of medicine and the world of natural philosophy, embodying the Renaissance ideal of the learned man. His medical career gave him income, respect, and position. But it was his restless mind, turning ever toward invisible forces, that would secure his place in history. Within a few years he would publish a book that changed the course of science, De Magnete. Before William Gilbert placed lodestone upon his table and declared the earth itself to be a magnet, humankind had lived for millennia with only fragments of understanding. Magnets and amber were known since antiquity, yet their mysteries were wrapped in myth, poetry, and speculation. To grasp the significance of Gilbert's achievement, one must first step back into the long centuries when magnetism and electricity belonged more to legend than to science. The story begins in the ancient world, where Greeks encountered curious stones that seemed to possess life. The earliest reference comes from Thales of Miletus, 624-546 BCE, one of the seven sages. Thales observed that lodestone, a naturally magnetized piece of iron ore, could attract iron. To him, this meant that the stone had a soul. In Greek thought, motion was a sign of life, and since lodestones could move iron without touch, they were seen as animate, almost magical. Later, philosophers offered varied explanations. Aristotle noted the strange properties of magnets, but did not offer a full theory. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, 1st century CE, described how lodestones were named after Magnesia in Thessaly, where they were found. Roman poets even wove them into verse. Ovid, for example, spoke of the Magnesian stone that draws the black iron. To the ancients, the magnet was a curiosity, a marvel of nature that blurred the line between the living and the inert. But it remained unexplained, filed away with other wonders of the natural world. If lodestone was the stone that attracted iron, amber was the stone that attracted light objects when rubbed. The Greeks noticed that when a piece of amber, electron in Greek, was rubbed with wool or fur, it could draw feathers or straw toward it. This phenomenon was subtle and easily dismissed as trickery or air currents. Yet it fascinated thinkers. Thales once again is credited with remarking on this property, though he likely saw it as part of his broader view of natural animation. The Greeks gave amber its name, and from this came the word electricity. But for centuries, the effect remained a curiosity, not a field of study. The knowledge of magnetism was not confined to the Mediterranean. In ancient China, compasses made from lodestones were in use by the Han Dynasty, 2nd century BCE. Initially, they were not used for navigation at sea, but for geomancy and divination. The Chinese believed the magnet aligned with the cosmic forces of the earth. By the Song Dynasty, 11th century CE, compasses had been adapted for navigation, helping sailors cross seas with unprecedented confidence. In India, references to magnetic stones appear in Sanskrit texts, suggesting awareness of their power to attract iron. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars such as al-Biruni, 11th century, discussed magnets in more detail, conducting observations on their attraction and polarity. Islamic navigators and scholars passed this knowledge to Europe through trade and conquest. These traditions preserved and expanded magnetism's reputation, even if they did not yet dissect it scientifically. By the medieval period, magnets were well known in Europe, but their meaning was entangled with superstition. Stories abounded of lodestones that could heal illnesses, ward off evil, or even detect infidelity. Amber, too, was believed to have protective powers when worn as jewelry. At the same time, practical use grew. Sailors in the Mediterranean and later in northern Europe began to rely on the magnetic compass. By the 12th and 13th centuries, descriptions of compasses appear in European manuscripts, and by the Age of Discovery, they were indispensable. Yet sailors used them with awe, treating them as almost mystical instruments. Some even believed compasses worked because they were influenced by the pole star rather than by the earth itself. In the Renaissance, a few thinkers attempted to study magnets more carefully. Petrus Peregrinus de Maricourt, a French scholar of the 13th century, wrote Epistola de Magnete, Letter on the Magnet. He described the poles of a magnet and how a sphere of lodestone could move a compass needle. This was the first systematic European text on magnetism, though it remained largely unknown. By the 15th and 16th centuries, curiosity was growing. Explorers relied more on compasses, and scholars speculated about Earth's role. Yet no one dared to claim what Gilbert would soon declare with authority, that the Earth itself was magnetic. As for electricity, it languished as a parlor trick. Scholars noted that amber and glass could attract chaff when rubbed, but there was no language or framework to explore it. It was not until Gilbert that electricity would be defined as something distinct from magnetism. Thus, by the late 16th century, the world stood at a crossroads. Sailors used compasses daily, but no one understood why they worked. Scholars admired magnets and amber, but filed them away as oddities rather than as keys to natural law. Superstition still cloaked these phenomena in mystery. Into this world stepped William Gilbert, a physician, a thinker, and above all, a man of experiment. Where others repeated tradition, he tested. Where others speculated, he observed. And in 1600, with the publication of De Magnete, he tore away centuries of myth and gave the world its first true science of invisible forces. The year 1600 was a turning point in the intellectual history of Europe. Shakespeare was writing his great plays, the Elizabethan court flourished in splendor, and across the continent, Galileo prepared to aim his telescope at the heavens. Amid this ferment, a physician from London released a book that would quietly but profoundly alter the course of science. That man was William Gilbert, and his book was De Magnet, Magnetisque Corporibus, et de Magno Magnet, Tellure on the Magnet, Magnetic Bodies, and the Great Magnet the Earth. It was unusual enough for a physician to venture into natural philosophy, but it was daring beyond measure to publish a 6-volume treatise on a subject as arcane as magnetism. Yet Gilbert had been preparing for decades, experimenting tirelessly with lodestones, compasses, and amber. By 1600, he was ready not merely to speculate, but to prove. In an age when most science was commentary on Aristotle, Gilbert's work was shocking for its originality. It was not a book of inherited wisdom. It was a book of experiments, observations, and conclusions. In this sense, De Magnete represents the dawn of modern experimental science. De Magnete is divided into 6 books, each addressing a different aspect of magnetism and electricity. Book I, The History of Magnets and Magnetic Philosophy. Book II, Experiments with Lodestones, including Polarity. Book III, The Motions of Magnetic Bodies and Forces. Book IV, The Earth Itself as a Magnet. Book V, The Compass and Navigation. Book VI, Electricity and Bodies that Attract After Rubbing. This structure was deliberate. Gilbert began with what was known, introduced his experiments, then built toward his revolutionary claim that the Earth itself is a giant magnet. At the heart of De Magnete lay Gilbert's method. He did not merely repeat ancient authorities, he tested them. For example, while Aristotle and Pliny wrote that garlic weakened the power of a magnet, Gilbert tested this claim. He placed garlic near a lodestone and found no effect. He mocked the ancients for blindly accepting myths and declared that only experiment could reveal truth. His laboratory contained instruments of his own design, including the Torella, a spherical lodestone he carved to model the Earth. By moving compasses around it, he demonstrated how the Earth's poles and magnetic field could explain navigation. This was revolutionary. Instead of imagining the compass guided by stars or by divine forces, Gilbert showed that the earth itself exerted magnetic power. Gilbert's most famous claim is found in Book 4. The earth itself is a great magnet. This idea shattered centuries of speculation. Sailors had long used compasses, but no one understood why the needle pointed north. Some thought the pole star pulled it. Others believed mountains of magnetic stone at the world's edge exerted a force. Gilbert swept these myths aside. Through careful experiments with his Torella, he showed that a compass needle behaves around a lodestone sphere just as it does on Earth. The simplest explanation was also the boldest. The entire Earth is magnetic. This insight not only explained the compass, but also laid the foundation for geomagnetism, a field of science that continues today. In Book 6, Gilbert turned to amber and other materials that, when rubbed, attracted light objects. He coined the term electrica, from the Greek electron, amber, to describe these substances. Though his understanding of electricity was limited compared to later discoveries, Gilbert was the first to distinguish electricity from magnetism. He observed that while magnets acted at a distance on iron consistently, electric effects were weaker, temporary, and acted on light objects like straw or dust. This separation of phenomena was crucial. It gave electricity its own identity in science, even if centuries would pass before Franklin, Volta, and Faraday unlocked its deeper secrets. For Elizabethan England, a maritime power hungry for exploration, Gilbert's discoveries had immediate relevance. His explanation of magnetic variation, why the compass does not point exactly north, helped improve navigation. This was not abstract philosophy. It was practical science with life and death consequences for sailors crossing oceans. It is no accident that De Magnete was published in a nation of seafarers. England's empire was rising on the back of naval power, and Gilbert's science offered tools to guide it. De Magnete was met with astonishment. Scholars across Europe read it with fascination. Johannes Kepler praised Gilbert for his boldness and attempted to apply magnetic ideas to planetary motion. Galileo admired his experimental spirit, calling him a pioneer of the new science. Even critics acknowledged that Gilbert had done something unprecedented. He had based natural philosophy not on authority, but on experiment. In England, Gilbert became a figure of respect, though not without skepticism. Some clung to older beliefs, unwilling to accept that Earth itself could be magnetic. Yet the tide had turned. Gilbert's experiments could be repeated, and repetition meant proof. With De Magnete, William Gilbert accomplished more than writing about magnets. He modeled a new way of doing science. His rejection of untested claims, his insistence on observation, and his careful recording of experiments anticipated the methods that Francis Bacon, Galileo, and later Isaac Newton would champion. In many ways, De Magnete is a microcosm of the scientific revolution, a bridge between medieval wonder and modern science. Where once magnets and amber were curiosities, after Gilbert they became the keys to hidden forces of nature. It is striking that Gilbert was not primarily a natural philosopher by profession, but a physician. Yet this dual identity was his strength. He brought to physics the same habits he applied in medicine: observation, diagnosis, testing, and correction. Just as a physician must learn from the body rather than from dogma, so Gilbert learned from magnets rather than from Aristotle. In this sense, Gilbert stands as one of the earliest practitioners of what we now call the scientific method. When De Magnete appeared in 1600, it did not answer every question. Gilbert could not explain why Earth was magnetic, nor did he foresee the full potential of electricity. Yet his book marked the beginning of a new intellectual age. It was the first great work of modern physics, the first to treat invisible forces with systematic experiment. From this point forward, science would never again be content with mere speculation. When William Gilbert declared in De Magnete that the Earth itself is a great magnet, He did more than introduce a new scientific idea. He changed humanity's understanding of the planet beneath their feet. What had once been seen as a mysterious background stage for human life was suddenly revealed to be an active, dynamic body with hidden powers. The Earth itself, Gilbert argued, was not inert but alive with invisible forces that shaped navigation, exploration, and ultimately the destiny of nations. To reach this bold conclusion, Gilbert relied on one of the most elegant experimental tools of the Renaissance, the terrella. This was a sphere carved from lodestone, polished and smoothed until it resembled a miniature Earth. Gilbert placed a small compass needle on the surface of the terrella, and to his astonishment, the needle behaved as if it were on Earth itself, pointing toward poles, aligning along lines of force, dipping at angles similar to what sailors observed across different latitudes. Through this model, Gilbert demonstrated that the Earth and the lodestone were governed by the same magnetic principles. The compass was not influenced by stars, mountains, or supernatural forces. It responded to the planet itself. The simplicity of the experiment belied its profundity. In a single stroke, Gilbert had shown that Earth was not just a stage, but an actor in the cosmic drama. This claim directly contradicted centuries of speculation. Many medieval scholars believed the compass needle pointed north because of the pole star. Others thought vast mountains of magnetic stone at the northern edge of the world pulled the needle. Still others attributed the phenomenon to occult or divine powers. Gilbert dismissed these ideas with characteristic sharpness. He argued that sailors who believed in magnetic mountains had been misled by fables. His experiments with the terrella provided a natural, repeatable explanation. Where tradition relied on authority, Gilbert relied on evidence. One of the great puzzles of navigation was magnetic variation, the fact that a compass needle does not always point exactly north. Sailors had observed this deviation for centuries, but no one had explained it. Gilbert, through his terrella, showed that variation was a natural property of Earth's magnetism. Just as a lodestone sphere exhibited shifting directions, so too did the Earth. This insight was not merely academic. For Elizabethan sailors crossing to the New World or venturing into the Arctic, compasses were lifelines. By improving understanding of variation, Gilbert gave navigators more confidence in their instruments. His science, therefore, had immediate practical consequences for England's growing naval empire. Another phenomenon Gilbert explained was magnetic dip, the tendency of a compass needle to tilt downward rather than lie flat. Sailors noticed that near the equator the needle stayed level, but as they traveled north, the needle dipped downward. With his terrella, Gilbert showed this was a natural effect of the Earth's magnetism. Needles aligned with lines of force that curved into the planet. This discovery added a new layer of understanding to geomagnetism. The Earth was not only magnetic, its magnetism varied systematically across latitude. In essence, Gilbert had begun the science of magnetic mapping, a field that centuries later would aid global exploration and even theories of plate tectonics. Gilbert's vision of Earth was revolutionary not only in science but in philosophy. Medieval cosmology saw Earth as passive, fixed, and lifeless. Gilbert, by contrast, described it as dynamic, active, and filled with natural virtue. The Earth itself, he insisted, possessed a soul-like power expressed through magnetism. While he did not abandon all metaphysical language, he sometimes spoke of magnetic spirit. His emphasis was on natural explanation, not mysticism. This blending of observation and philosophy placed Gilbert at the cusp of modernity. He retained the Renaissance idea of a living Earth, but grounded it in repeatable experiment. Gilbert's claim that Earth was magnetic had implications beyond navigation. Johannes Kepler, fascinated by Gilbert's work, attempted to apply magnetism to celestial mechanics. He speculated that planets might move in their orbits through magnetic attraction to the Sunday. While this theory was ultimately flawed, it revealed the power of Gilbert's idea. By describing invisible forces operating on Earth, Gilbert encouraged astronomers to imagine similar forces acting in the heavens, a conceptual step that would pave the way for Newton's law of gravitation. For sailors, Gilbert's theory meant safer voyages. For philosophers, it meant a rethinking of Earth's role in the cosmos. For science itself, it meant the triumph of experiment over authority. With a simple demonstration of a terrella and a compass, Gilbert linked the local with the global, the practical with the profound. What is most striking about Gilbert's claim is his confidence. In a time when heresy could cost a man his life, he did not hedge his word. He wrote, "Magnus magnus ips est globus terrestris." The earth itself is a great magnet. He dared to state it not as speculation, but as fact. This courage to move from cautious suggestion to bold assertion distinguished him from lesser thinkers. Gilbert's vision of Earth as a magnet resonated through centuries. In the 18th century, Edmund Halley attempted to map Earth's magnetic field for navigation. In the 19th century, Carl Friedrich Gauss and Alexander von Humboldt expanded geomagnetism into a global science. In the 20th century, theories of Earth's core and plate tectonics confirmed that deep processes generate the magnetic field Gilbert first described. Though his tools were simple, his insight was astonishingly prescient. To declare Earth a magnet was to change humanity's relationship with its world. No longer was magnetism a curiosity confined to stones and compasses. It was a planetary force, binding human destiny to the deep structure of the globe. Gilbert had revealed an invisible architecture that shaped navigation, exploration, and science itself. From this point forward, magnets would no longer be toys of myth or tools of sailors. They would be keys to understanding the very nature of Earth. While William Gilbert's fame rests most securely on his theory of the Earth as a magnet, his legacy is equally tied to another, subtler set of observations: the curious attractions of amber, glass, and other rubbed substances. These experiments, recorded in the final book of De Magnete, gave birth to an entirely new field of inquiry. Though crude in method and modest in scope, they marked the first clear recognition of electricity as a phenomenon distinct from magnetism. Long before Gilbert, the ancients had marveled at amber's strange property. When rubbed with cloth or fur, a piece of amber could attract light objects, chaff, feathers, bits of straw. To the Greeks, this was a wonder. They called amber electron, and from this word, centuries later, Gilbert coined his term electricus. Yet for millennia, the effect remained nothing more than a parlor trick, noted by Thales of Miletus and Pliny the Elder, but never investigated with rigor. Gilbert, however, was not content with marvel. He wanted method. In De Magnet Book 6, Gilbert described experiments with amber, glass, sulfur, and even certain precious stones. He rubbed them with cloth, then brought them near light materials such as straw or small scraps of paper. Consistently, these rubbed bodies attracted the objects. Gilbert concluded that such substances possessed a power akin to that of magnets, but not identical. To describe this, he introduced a new word, electricus, meaning like amber. From this came the modern word electricity. With that single linguistic creation, Gilbert separated one invisible force from another, giving each its own place in natural philosophy. Gilbert's genius lay not in discovering electricity. People had known amber's trick for thousands of years, but in distinguishing it from magnetism. He noted key differences. Magnetism acted only on iron and operated through stable, enduring poles. Electric effects, by contrast, acted on many light materials, chaff, dust, feathers, but were weak, temporary, and faded quickly after rubbing. Magnets could attract without preparation, while electric bodies required rubbing to become active. This careful separation was revolutionary. For the first time, electricity had been named and defined as its own phenomenon. Gilbert's experiments were simple and, by later standards, primitive. He did not know about sparks, lightning, or electrical conduction. He did not imagine charges or currents. His concept of electricity was confined to rubbed materials producing weak attractions. Yet even within this narrow scope, his insistence on classification and terminology mattered. By naming electricus, he opened a path that future generations would walk. Without Gilbert, Franklin might not have spoken of electrical fire. Volta might not have built his pile, and Faraday might not have envisioned electric fields. What makes Gilbert's study of electricity remarkable is his attitude. Where others saw curiosities, he saw patterns. Where others repeated anecdotes, he tested systematically. He cataloged which materials displayed electric properties and which did not. He rejected myths and insisted on demonstration. This approach was the essence of his philosophy. Observe, test, define, separate. In his hands, amber ceased to be a trinket and became a window into a hidden force of nature. Gilbert's reflections on electricity also reveal his broader worldview. He believed nature was filled with hidden virtues powers that express themselves in stones, metals, and the earth itself. Yet, unlike the occultists of his time, he did not cloak these virtues in secrecy. He sought to expose them, to measure them, to place them within a rational framework. Electricity, for him, was not magic, but a natural power awaiting study. It is striking that Gilbert's insights into electricity were not immediately followed by further research. For nearly 150 years after De Magnete, electricity languished in obscurity. It was only in the 17th and 18th centuries that men like Otto von Guericke, Robert Boyle, and Stephen Gray expanded upon Gilbert's observations, producing sparks, exploring conduction, and beginning to imagine electricity as a universal force. Yet even when later scientists surpassed him, they acknowledged his role. Gilbert had given electricity its name, its identity, and its first place in the book of science. Though Gilbert never made the leap, we can see in hindsight how the humble attraction of rubbed amber foreshadowed the vast science of electricity. The faint pull of straw toward amber contained within it the lightning that Franklin would capture, the circuits that Volta would build, the motors that Faraday would spin, and the global networks of power that light our world today. All of this began with a physician in Elizabethan London rubbing stones by candlelight and daring to ask, is this force the same as magnetism, or something new entirely? By writing the word electricus into the pages of De Magnete, William Gilbert did more than coin a term. He planted a flag in the landscape of knowledge. He declared that nature contained not one hidden force, but many, and that each deserved to be named, studied, and understood on its own terms. The word electricity has since grown far beyond Gilbert's imagination, yet its roots lie in his experiments with amber, glass, and silk, simple acts that transformed curiosity into a science. When William Gilbert published De Magnete in 1600, his ideas did not remain in the study or laboratory. They touched the sea. For sailors, merchants, and explorers in Elizabethan England, his discoveries about magnetism were not abstract philosophy, but matters of life and death. Navigation was the engine of empire, and the compass, the sailor's most trusted tool, was now explained with unprecedented clarity. In this sense, Gilbert was not merely a scientist, he was a navigator's silent companion, a hidden figure steering England's ships toward the wider world. Before Gilbert, the compass was widely used but poorly understood. Sailors knew that the needle pointed roughly north, but they also knew it varied, sometimes slightly, sometimes dangerously. The reasons for this variation were cloaked in myth. Some believed in magnetic mountains at the world's edges, others in celestial influence from the pole star. A few practical treatises offered rules of thumb, but no unified theory existed. This uncertainty bred fear. Mariners crossing vast oceans relied on a tool they could not explain, and any unexplained deviation could mean disaster. In this climate, Gilbert's De Magnete offered something new. a coherent natural philosophy of the compass. Gilbert's theory that the Earth itself is a magnet explained both magnetic variation, the deviation of the needle from true north, and magnetic dip, the tendency of the needle to tilt downward in northern latitudes. With his Torella experiments, he demonstrated how variation was a natural result of Earth's magnetic field and how dip increased with latitude. For sailors, this meant that compasses were not failing or bewitched. They were following predictable laws of nature. Though practical application was still limited, the psychological effect was enormous. A navigator, armed with Gilbert's book, could believe that the compass needle's quirks were part of a larger, comprehensible order. The timing of Gilbert's discoveries was critical. By 1600, England was emerging as a major naval power. Sir Francis Drake had circumnavigated the globe. Sir Walter Raleigh had attempted colonies in the New World. Rivalries with Spain and Portugal, the established maritime giants, demanded better navigation. Gilbert's science gave England a subtle but powerful advantage: confidence in its instruments. His explanation of magnetic forces provided intellectual support to the sailors who risked their lives on uncharted seas. Elizabeth's court, hungry for exploration, must have seen in Gilbert's work not just curiosity, but utility. De Magnete was not written solely for scholars. Its diagrams of compasses, lodestones, and the Torella were accessible to navigators as well. While Latin was the language of the book, its implications filtered quickly into English maritime practice. Navigators learned that variation was not random but systematic, and that dip could serve as a crude indicator of latitude. In the centuries that followed, Gilbert's ideas inspired attempts to map Earth's magnetic field, a project that would become central to naval supremacy. By linking magnetism to geography, Gilbert opened the door to what we now call geomagnetic cartography. It is no exaggeration to say that Gilbert's science contributed to the age of discovery. Navigation was the key to empire, and magnetism was the key to navigation. Without compasses, sailors could not cross oceans. Without understanding compasses, they sailed in fear. Gilbert transformed that fear into knowledge. England's rise as a maritime empire in the 17th century owes as much to ships, cannons, and courage as it does to invisible forces. But behind the wood and iron of the fleet stood Gilbert's insight, the earth itself guiding the needle guiding the ship extending the reach of a nation. Gilbert's ideas spread beyond England. European navigators, scholars, and mapmakers read De Magnete and integrated its lessons. The Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish all recognized the value of his explanations. Over time, his theory became the foundation for more precise navigation tables, which enabled safer voyages to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Thus, a physician in Elizabethan London quietly shaped the course of global history. His work connected the study of invisible forces to the expansion of human horizons. Gilbert's impact on navigation also hinted at a larger truth, that the same invisible forces guiding a sailor's needle might also guide the planets. Kepler took Gilbert's magnetism as inspiration for his own speculations about celestial mechanics. Though Kepler's magnetic model of planetary motion proved flawed, it was a step toward Newton's gravitational synthesis. In this sense, the compass needle on a ship's deck became a bridge between earthly voyages and cosmic laws. It is fitting that De Magnete appeared at the dawn of the 17th century when the world was opening in every direction. Gilbert gave explorers a new confidence, linking the mysteries of nature to the ambitions of empire. His experiments were not conducted in isolation, they resonated with the practical needs of his nation. By showing that the compass needle obeyed the Earth's magnetism, Gilbert provided explorers with more than knowledge. He gave them trust in their tools and, by extension, trust in their voyages. In this way, his science was woven into the sails of Elizabethan ships, carrying England across the seas. The year 1600, when William Gilbert's De Magnete appeared, was also the year Galileo Galilei began his tenure as professor of mathematics at the University of Padua. The two men never met, and it is unlikely they corresponded, but their names are forever linked in the tapestry of the scientific revolution. Both rejected the chains of scholastic tradition, both turned to experiment as their guide, and both dared to challenge centuries of authority. Gilbert and Galileo lived in a world dominated by Aristotle's physics and Ptolemy's astronomy. For centuries, European scholars had repeated the teachings of the ancients without testing them. Heavy bodies fall faster than light ones. The heavens move in perfect circles. The earth is passive and still. These assumptions formed the foundation of medieval science. By 1600, however, cracks were appearing. Copernicus had proposed a heliocentric universe. Tycho Brahe was mapping the skies with precision. Renaissance humanism had reawakened interest in original sources, prompting scholars to compare, question, and doubt. Into this shifting landscape stepped Gilbert and Galileo, each armed with an insistence on observation. Gilbert's domain was the invisible world of forces. With his terrella, he demonstrated that the earth was magnetic. With amber and glass, he named and separated electricity. His method was simple but radical. Test every claim. He ridiculed Aristotle's followers for repeating myths about garlic weakening magnets and instead demanded empirical proof. His experiments did not merely support navigation, they laid the foundation for a science of forces, the precursor to Newtonian physics. For Gilbert, truth was not found in ancient texts, but in the behavior of nature under experiment. Meanwhile, Galileo was turning his eyes and instruments toward motion, mechanics, and astronomy. He rolled balls down inclined planes to test acceleration, demonstrating that all bodies fall at the same rate regardless of weight. He improved the telescope and aimed it skyward, discovering mountains on the moon, moons orbiting Jupiter, and the phases of Venus, all evidence against the Ptolemaic system. Like Gilbert, Galileo defied blind adherence to Aristotle. Where Gilbert declared the earth a magnet, Galileo declared it a moving planet. Both claims shook the intellectual foundations of their age. Though they never crossed paths, Gilbert and Galileo were kindred spirits. Each rejected scholastic authority in favor of experiment. Built instruments, the terrella, the inclined plane, the telescope to probe nature directly, challenged cosmology. Gilbert, by giving Earth an active role as a magnetic, laid groundwork for Newton. Gilbert's magnetism suggested forces shaping motion. Galileo's dynamics described how motion behaved. Newton would unite both into universal law. Together, they embodied the transition from philosophy to science. Despite their similarities, there were differences. Galileo's work was more dramatic, confronting the church directly and sparking conflict with religious authorities. Gilbert's work, while revolutionary, remained within the safer realm of natural philosophy and medicine, sheltered by his role at court. Galileo's discoveries entered the public imagination: moons, telescopes, trials. Gilbert's contributions, though quieter, were just as essential, giving science the language of forces and electricity. Historical evidence suggests Galileo admired Gilbert's methods. He reportedly considered De Magnete a model of experimental philosophy. Galileo, too, saw himself as part of a new breed of thinker, neither scholastic nor alchemist, but experimenter. That Gilbert's name stood alongside his in this intellectual revolution is testament to their shared vision. If one imagines the scientific revolution as a great cathedral, Galileo was the architect of its structure, and Gilbert one of its masons, carving the stones of method and experiment. Together they broke with tradition and built a new intellectual order. Gilbert gave science the first language of invisible forces. Galileo gave it the first laws of motion. Both together pointed toward the synthesis Newton would achieve in the 17th century. The true link between Gilbert and Galileo is not in their subjects but in their spirit. The belief that nature must be interrogated by test, not trusted on authority. Each man, in his own field, embodied the experimental turn that defines modern science. For Gilbert, the compass needle proved the Earth's magnetism. For Galileo, the swinging lamp in Pisa's cathedral revealed the law of the pendulum. Both men took simple observations, tested them with instruments, and derived universal truths. In this sense, Gilbert and Galileo were not just contemporaries. They were brothers in method, pioneers of the same revolution. When William Gilbert released De Magnete in 1600, he did not simply add another book to the growing shelves of Renaissance scholarship. He presented Europe with a bold vision of nature that challenged long-standing assumptions. Some greeted his work with enthusiasm, recognizing in it the dawn of a new scientific age. Others met it with skepticism, reluctant to abandon the comfort of Aristotle or the authority of medieval commentators. The reception of De Magnete thus reveals both the brilliance of Gilbert's ideas and the intellectual turbulence of the age. In Elizabethan England, Gilbert's reputation as the Queen's physician gave his book credibility from the start. Scholars and navigators took notice. Mariners, though not prone to read dense Latin texts, heard of his claims indirectly through summaries, lectures, and practical demonstrations. For them, the explanation of magnetic variation and dip was of immediate interest. Among university scholars, the reaction was mixed. Some praised his rigorous experiments, recognizing a method unlike anything that had come before. Others dismissed his ideas as speculative, uneasy with the claim that Earth itself was a magnet. To them, this was too radical, too disruptive of established cosmology. On the continent, Gilbert's work quickly spread. Copies of De Magnete reached universities in Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. Humanist scholars, already accustomed to questioning tradition, were intrigued. The book's clear diagrams and systematic approach impressed readers. Johannes Kepler, fascinated by invisible forces, praised Gilbert's experiments and attempted to apply magnetism to planetary motion. Though Kepler's magnetic theory of orbits proved incorrect, it showed how inspiring Gilbert's work could be. Galileo Galilei reportedly admired Gilbert's reliance on experiment, considering him a model of the new natural philosophy. In contrast, more conservative scholars in Spain and certain Catholic institutions expressed caution, reluctant to endorse a claim that upended Aristotelian physics. Not everyone was persuaded. Some scholars argued that Gilbert had overextended his evidence. Yes, lodestones and compasses behaved in certain ways, but could one truly declare the entire Earth a magnet? To many, this leap seemed presumptuous. Others criticized his use of magnetic spirit language, which seemed too mystical. Though Gilbert sought natural explanations, his occasional metaphysical phrasing allowed detractors to dismiss him as speculative. In the medical community, too, some looked askance. Why should a physician concern himself with stones and needles rather than bodies and humors? For them, Gilbert was straying too far from his profession. Despite scholarly doubts, navigators found Gilbert's explanations practical. The age of discovery was expanding, and every insight into compass behavior mattered. English sailors, emboldened by the claim that Earth itself governed the needle, placed greater trust in their instruments. The maritime community, pragmatic and results-oriented, gave Gilbert the kind of validation that academic debate often could not. By the early 17th century, De Magnete had become one of the most widely discussed works of natural philosophy in Europe. It stood alongside Copernicus's De Revolutionibus and Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica as a landmark text that redefined its field. Its influence spread not only among natural philosophers, but also among instrument makers, navigators, and cartographers. The very tools of exploration, compasses, charts, and globes were now built with Gilbert's ideas in mind. What truly distinguished De Magnete in the eyes of its readers was not just its content, but its method. Gilbert had done something new. He had systematically experimented, recorded results, and built a theory grounded in observation. This was the hallmark of the scientific revolution. To admirers, Gilbert was a prophet of modern science. To skeptics, he was a dangerous innovator, destabilizing centuries of accepted wisdom. Yet even his critics could not ignore him. By forcing debate, he ensured that magnetism and electricity would become central topics of natural philosophy. In the decades after his death, Gilbert's influence only grew. Later, natural philosophers Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton looked back on him as a pioneer of the experimental method. Even those who disagreed with his conclusions acknowledged his courage. Skepticism had greeted him at first, but influence triumphed in the long run. By daring to publish De Magnete, Gilbert ensured that every future discussion of forces, fields, and invisible powers would bear his imprint. When Queen Elizabeth I died in March 1603, the long and glorious Elizabethan age ended. Her successor, James VI of Scotland, ascended the English throne as James I, inaugurating the Stuart dynasty. For William Gilbert, who had risen to prominence as Elizabeth's trusted physician and natural philosopher, the transition was both opportunity and burden. His career reached its peak, but his life, tragically, was nearing its end. Elizabeth's trust had made Gilbert one of the most respected physicians in England. Her death might have ended his influence, but instead James I recognized Gilbert's reputation and retained him as physician to the king. It was a position of immense honor. Few men could claim to serve both the Virgin Queen and her successor. At court, Gilbert continued to practice medicine for the royal household. His status brought him into contact with the most powerful figures of the realm's statesmen, nobles, ambassadors. His name was associated not only with health, but also with science, for De Magnete was still fresh in the minds of scholars across Europe. Yet if his prestige was at its height, his health was beginning to fail. The early Stuart period was a time of both promise and anxiety. England's future was uncertain, with new dynastic politics and lingering religious tensions. At the same time, science was accelerating. Galileo was preparing to publish his Sidereus Nuncius, 1610, and Kepler was developing his laws of planetary motion. Gilbert, had he lived longer, might have engaged with these discoveries. He stood on the cusp of even greater debates, but his life would not extend far enough to join them. In late 1603, plague returned to London. The disease was swift and merciless, spreading through crowded streets and killing tens of thousands. Physicians were among the most vulnerable, for they could not avoid contact with the sick. Gilbert, devoted to his patients, continued his work, but the risk grew daily. By autumn, Gilbert himself fell ill. Whether his death was due to plague or another illness remains uncertain, but the timing suggests infection. The very qualities that made him a respected physician, his willingness to serve, his presence among the afflicted, may have sealed his fate. William Gilbert died in November 1603, only months after Elizabeth's passing. He was 59 years old. His death cut short a career that seemed poised for even greater achievement. The man who had dared to declare the earth a magnet, who had given electricity its name, was gone just as his ideas were beginning to spread across Europe. He was buried in his hometown of Colchester in Holy Trinity Church. There, a modest monument commemorated him not as a courtier or physician, but as a natural philosopher. Colchester, which had seen his boyhood, now received him in death. Gilbert's passing left much unfinished. He had planned further studies, perhaps a continuation of De Magnete. His notes and instruments, left behind, hinted at projects that might have advanced the understanding of forces even further. Instead, others would take up the torch: Galileo, Kepler, and later Newton. Gilbert's absence did not halt the progress of science, but it robbed the revolution of one of its earliest champions. The irony of Gilbert's death cannot be ignored. He died in the very year his fame was at its height, in the very season when Europe most needed pioneers of his caliber. Had he lived even another decade, he might have engaged with Galileo's telescopic discoveries, debated Kepler's magnetism, and influenced the course of the new natural philosophy more directly. Instead, his voice fell silent, leaving others to build on the foundations he had laid. By the time of his death, Gilbert was known across Europe. His book was read by scholars in Italy, Germany, and England. His reputation as both physician and philosopher was secure. In dying too soon, he gained something paradoxical, the aura of a trailblazer cut off before his time. Posterity remembered him not as an old man fading into irrelevance, but as a bold figure whose insights still seemed fresh. William Gilbert's final years remind us of the unity of his life. He was never solely a physician or solely a scientist. He was both. He served the sick and dying with the same spirit of observation he applied to magnets and amber. He pursued truth in bodies and in nature alike. His death in the midst of plague underscored that dual identity, a man of science brought low by the very reality he sought to understand. In November 1603, only months after Queen Elizabeth I's death and James I's accession, William Gilbert's voice fell silent. The man who had dared to reimagine the earth as a vast magnet, who had coined the word electricus, who had served two monarchs as royal physician, was himself overtaken by the great equalizer of his age, the plague. The plague was more than a disease. It was a presence that shaped every aspect of Elizabethan and Jacobean life. It closed theaters, halted commerce, and sent nobles fleeing from London to the countryside. For physicians like Gilbert, the plague was both a challenge and a nemesis. Medicine in his day could offer little more than palliatives. Observation and regimen might help with fevers or wounds, but against plague, even the most skilled physician was nearly powerless. That Gilbert may have succumbed to this very illness is a grim irony. The same man who sought to lift science from superstition was undone by a force still beyond science's reach. For contemporaries, Gilbert's death was both a personal loss and a symbolic one. Here was a physician whose service to Elizabeth had been exemplary, whose book had astonished Europe, struck down in the prime of his reputation. Among his peers, there must have been a sense of unfinished promise. He had opened a door into a new world of forces, yet he would not live to step fully through it. In Colchester, where he was buried at Holy Trinity Church, his death would have been marked with both civic pride and sorrow. The local boy, who had risen to the court of the Queen and to the esteem of scholars across Europe, had returned home not in triumph, but in silence. The timing of Gilbert's death gave it symbolic weight. He died in the same year as Elizabeth I, marking the end of an age. The Elizabethan era had been one of daring voyages, cultural flowering, and the first sparks of scientific revolution. With Gilbert's death, it seemed as though a chapter of intellectual boldness closed, even as James I's reign opened new opportunities. His passing during plague also reinforced the image of science as vulnerable yet resilient. The disease that killed Gilbert would not stop the ideas he had released into the world. His body was laid to rest, but his book, De Magnete, continued its journey across Europe. Books outlive their authors. Gilbert's De Magnete was read long after his death, inspiring generations of thinkers. Navigators consulted it for practical guidance. Philosophers admired its experimental method. Kepler built upon its magnetism to imagine planetary motion. Galileo praised its spirit of inquiry. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when electricity began to be explored more systematically, Gilbert's name was remembered as the man who had first coined the term. Even when his theories were surpassed, his role as pioneer was honored. Between Gilbert's death in 1603 and the flowering of electrical science in the 18th century, his insights remained underappreciated. For over 100 years, electricity was little more than a curiosity. Magnetism advanced more slowly, too, with sporadic contributions from natural philosophers. Yet Gilbert's book remained a touchstone, cited and remembered, even if few could build upon it immediately. This forgotten century of electricity underscores Gilbert's importance. Without him, there might have been nothing to remember at all, no foundation on which later scientists could build. By the 18th and 19th centuries, when Benjamin Franklin, Alessandro Volta, and Michael Faraday transformed electricity into a modern science, Gilbert's name returned to prominence. Historians began to call him the father of electricity and magnetism. His experiments were seen as the first stirrings of the scientific method in physics. In truth, his work was limited, confined to simple observations. Yet his method, the insistence on experiment, the rejection of myth, the courage to generalize was what mattered. His legacy was less about specific discoveries than about a new way of knowing. Gilbert's death during plague embodies the paradox of his life. He was a man who sought rational explanations in an age of superstition, yet he lived and died in a world still ruled by forces beyond understanding. His medical practice placed him at the front line of disease, while his scientific practice placed him at the frontier of knowledge. He bridged two worlds, the fragility of human life and the durability of human ideas. Today, Gilbert is remembered not only in Colchester, but in the annals of science. His name stands with Copernicus, Vesalius, Galileo, and Kepler as one of the architects of the scientific revolution. His book remains a landmark of experimental natural philosophy. His life, though cut short, demonstrates the power of curiosity and courage to reshape human understanding. William Gilbert did not live to see the modern world he helped create, but his magnetism, both literal and metaphorical, still draws us back to him. William Gilbert's De Magnete was not a closed book. Though he died in 1603, his ideas rippled across Europe for centuries, inspiring and challenging some of the greatest scientific minds in history. The chain of influence, from Johannes Kepler to Isaac Newton to Michael Faraday, reveals how Gilbert's insights about magnetism and electricity laid a foundation for the deepest revolutions in physics. Kepler, magnetic planets in motion. Johannes Kepler, 1571-1630, the German astronomer and mathematician, was one of Gilbert's earliest admirers. Kepler was fascinated by invisible forces, and when he read De Magnete, he found in Gilbert's Earth as magnet a model for celestial mechanics. Kepler speculated that the planets might move around the sun because of magnetic attraction, imagining a kind of cosmic magnetism pulling them along their orbits. This was not correct physics, but it was a daring step. It showed how Gilbert's concept of invisible forces inspired astronomers to think beyond crystal spheres and Aristotelian mechanics. Though Kepler ultimately abandoned magnetism as the cause of planetary motion, he retained the idea of forces as real, measurable agents. His three laws of planetary motion became crucial for Newton, who later formulated universal gravitation. In this sense, Gilbert's magnetism was a stepping stone from ancient cosmology to modern physics. Newton, forces made universal. Isaac Newton, 1642-1727, the architect of classical physics, did not rely directly on Gilbert's magnetic theories, yet he inherited Gilbert's method and vision. Newton's insistence on experiment and mathematical rigor echoes Gilbert's rejection of authority in favor of observation. Newton also recognized the importance of Gilbert's work on magnetism. In his Principia Mathematica, 1687, he cited Gilbert's experiments with the compass needle and his notion of the Earth as a magnetic body. Newton's law of universal gravitation linking falling apples to orbiting moons was conceptually similar to Gilbert's linking of compasses to the Earth. Both treated invisible forces as real, measurable, and universal. Where Gilbert had spoken of magnetic virtue, Newton spoke of gravity. Both marked the triumph of unseen forces over medieval notions of direct contact and crystalline spheres. Faraday, the spiritual descendant. 2 centuries later, Michael Faraday, 1791-1867, brought Gilbert's legacy to life in a new age. Faraday, like Gilbert, came from modest beginnings and relied on experiment rather than formal mathematics. Where Gilbert rubbed amber and carved lodestones, Faraday spun coils and magnets, discovering electromagnetic induction, the foundation of modern electrical technology. Faraday acknowledged Gilbert as a predecessor, even calling him the father of electricity for coining the term. Faraday's conception of lines of force, which later became field theory, has roots in Gilbert's idea of Earth's magnetic virtue extending invisibly through space. Gilbert's Torella, demonstrating magnetic dip and variation, was an ancestor of Faraday's magnetic field experiments. The lineage is clear. Gilbert identified Earth as a magnet, coined electricus, introduced experiment into natural philosophy. Kepler, inspired by Gilbert, applied invisible forces to celestial motion. Newton unified forces into universal laws, grounding them in mathematics. Faraday explored electricity and magnetism as interwoven, leading to electromagnetism. Each built upon the spirit, if not always the details, of Gilbert's work. Together, they transformed science from speculation to a discipline of forces, fields, and laws. Gilbert did not know about electrons, currents, or electromagnetic waves. Yet his insistence on separating electricity from magnetism, his declaration that Earth was magnetic, and his reliance on experiment all prefigured the revolutions that came later. Without Gilbert, Kepler might not have imagined magnetic planets. Newton might not have found precedent for unseen forces, and Faraday might not have inherited the language of electricity. Gilbert was the bridge, the physician, natural philosopher who connected medieval wonder to modern physics. Today, when scientists map Earth's magnetic field from satellites, when engineers design electrical circuits, when physicists describe magnetic domains and quantum spins, they all stand, in some way, on Gilbert's shoulders. His role was not to complete the journey, but to point the way. William Gilbert had given the world a word electricus, and with it, a new category of natural phenomena. Yet after his death in 1603, electricity seemed to vanish into obscurity. For more than a century, no great strides were made in understanding it. Instead, electricity lingered in the margins of natural philosophy, treated as a parlor trick or curiosity rather than a science. This long silence, often overlooked, reveals both the limits of Gilbert's legacy and the durability of his vision. In the early 17th century, natural philosophers across Europe repeated Gilbert's amber experiments, but rarely advanced beyond them. Rubbing amber, glass, or sulfur to attract feathers or chaff became a fashionable demonstration in courts and salons. Ladies and gentlemen of learning delighted in the strange pull of electrics, but few considered it worthy of deeper study. This was the paradox. Gilbert had named electricity, but he had not yet shown its power. Without sparks, shocks, or lightning to reveal its grandeur, electricity seemed trivial. Magnetism, with its clear role in navigation, commanded attention. Electricity was left to linger in the shadows. Part of the neglect came from skepticism. Scholars admired Gilbert's bold claim that the Earth was a magnet, but electricity appeared too weak and uncertain. Unlike magnetism, which guided compasses across oceans, electricity seemed incapable of practical application. To many, it was nothing more than an oddity of rubbed stones. As a result, natural philosophers catalogued electrics without passion. Lists of substances that became electric after rubbing sapphire, diamond, glass, sulfur appeared in texts, but no systematic theory emerged. The first real progress came with Robert Boyle, 1627-1691, one of the founders of modern chemistry. Boyle repeated Gilbert's experiments, but with greater rigor. He observed that electrical attraction worked even in a vacuum, suggesting it was not caused by air currents, as some skeptics had claimed. Boyle's work was a crucial step. He proved that electricity was a genuine physical force, not an illusion. Yet even Boyle did not take the next leap. He recorded, described, and moved on. Electricity remained a curiosity, not a revolution. In the mid-17th century, the German scientist Otto von Guericke built the first crude electrical machine, a sulfur globe that, when rubbed, produced strong electrical effects. With it, he demonstrated visible sparks, the first hint that electricity might be more than a parlor trick. For the first time, electricity seemed powerful, even dangerous. Still, Guericke's machine did not lead to a full science. The sparks amazed observers, but no theory explained them. Electricity remained a marvel, caught between entertainment and investigation. The breakthrough came in the early 18th century with Stephen Gray, 1666-1736. Building upon Gilbert's and Boyle's foundations, Gray discovered that electricity could travel along materials. By suspending wires with silk and rubbing glass tubes, he showed that electricity could be conducted at a distance. This was revolutionary. Electricity was not confined to amber or glass, but could flow, move, and extend beyond its source. For the first time, electricity hinted at being a true force of nature, capable of transmission. Gilbert's word had found its reality. The forgotten century after Gilbert was not wasted, but it was slow. Electricity had to wait for better tools, more systematic curiosity, and a shift in cultural priorities. While magnetism gained prestige through navigation, electricity slumbered until sparks and shocks made it spectacular. Yet throughout this silence, Gilbert's distinction endured. Scholars remembered that electricity was not magnetism. The name electricus kept the phenomenon alive in the vocabulary of science, preserving it until the Enlightenment was ready to rediscover its potential. By the mid-18th century, electricity would burst into prominence. Franklin would prove lightning was electrical, Volta would invent the battery, and Faraday would unite electricity with magnetism. But none of that could have happened without Gilbert's first step. His coinage gave electricity a place in thought, even when no one knew what to do with it. The forgotten century is thus not a void, but a testimony. It reminds us that scientific revolutions often begin with seeds that lie dormant, waiting for the right soil and season to grow. Gilbert planted the seed. Later generations harvested the fruit. Few titles in the history of science carry as much weight as father. To call someone the father of electricity is to place them at the head of a lineage that leads through Franklin, Volta, Faraday, Maxwell, and Edison, a pantheon of names that shaped the modern world. William Gilbert, a physician from Colchester who died in 1603, is often given that title. But does he truly deserve it? Or is his claim more complex, more nuanced, than simple honorifics allow? There is no doubt that Gilbert's greatest achievement was in magnetism. His De Magneti laid the foundation for geomagnetism, explained the compass, and introduced the idea of Earth as a magnetic body. These contributions alone secure his place as the father of modern magnetism. His contributions to electricity were smaller but significant. He observed that rubbed substances like amber and glass could attract light objects. He cataloged which materials displayed this property. Most importantly, he coined the word electricus, giving the phenomenon a name and separating it from magnetism. In this act of naming and distinguishing, Gilbert planted the seed of a science, even if he did not cultivate it fully. Historians and scientists who grant Gilbert the title emphasize 3 points. He coined the terminology. Without Gilbert's word electricus, the phenomenon might have remained nameless and obscure. Naming is the first step toward science. He separated electricity from magnetism. By noting their differences, temporary versus permanent, attraction of many materials versus only iron, he gave electricity its own identity. he pioneered the experimental method. His insistence on testing, cataloging, and rejecting myths about electrics marked the beginning of a scientific approach to electricity. From this perspective, Gilbert is indeed the father, perhaps not of electrical technology, but of electrical science as a category of thought. Yet critics argue the title is misleading. Gilbert's electrical experiments were primitive and limited. He did not observe sparks, shocks, or currents. He made no connection between amber's attraction and lightning in the sky. He saw electricity as a weak curiosity, not a powerful force. By contrast, Benjamin Franklin, 1702, proved lightning was electrical. Alessandro Volta, 1800, created the first battery, and Michael Faraday, 1832, discovered electromagnetic induction. Compared to these giants, Gilbert seems more a footnote than a father. Thus, some argue Gilbert should be remembered as the father of magnetism, but not electricity. The truth lies between extremes. Gilbert did not discover electricity in the modern sense, but he gave it language, distinction, and legitimacy. He did not build the house, but he laid the cornerstone. To deny him completely would be to erase the importance of beginnings. To overstate him would be to blur the achievements of later pioneers. In this light, Gilbert is not the father of electricity as we know it, of batteries, currents, and circuits, but the father of electrical science as a concept. His work marks the threshold where electricity entered scientific consciousness. Over time, Gilbert's reputation has risen and fallen with the tides of scientific history. In the 17th century, he was remembered mostly for magnetism. In the 18th century, when electricity became spectacular, he was retroactively honored as its father. In the 19th century, Faraday and Maxwell overshadowed him, yet continued to credit him with laying foundations. Today, historians describe Gilbert more cautiously as a pioneer, a pathbreaker, and the originator of terminology. His importance lies not in the depth of his discoveries, but in the direction he pointed science toward. So, was Gilbert truly the father of electricity? If fatherhood means discovery of sparks, lightning, or currents, then no. If fatherhood means naming, distinguishing, and legitimizing a field, then yes. In either case, his role as pioneer is undeniable. Electricity's story begins with amber and glass in his study, just as magnetism's story begins with his Torella. Gilbert did not complete the journey, but he took the first step. And in science, as in exploration, the first step is often the hardest, the most courageous, and the most lasting. When we look back across the centuries at William Gilbert, the physician from Colchester who rubbed amber and carved lodestones, it is tempting to measure him by what came after against Franklin's lightning, Volta's battery, Faraday's induction, and Maxwell's equations. Gilbert's experiments appear simple, almost quaint, yet to judge him only by comparison is to miss the essence of his achievement. Gilbert did not discover electricity in its fullness, nor did he master magnetism as later scientists would. What he did was something more fundamental. He showed how nature must be studied. Gilbert lived in an age of transition. Born in 1544, he inherited a world of scholastic authority and Aristotelian dogma. By the time he died in 1603, he had helped inaugurate a world of experiment and proof. His dual identity as physician and natural philosopher defined him. In medicine, he observed the body. In science, he observed the earth. Both demanded evidence, patience, and courage. As Elizabeth's physician, he navigated the corridors of power. As author of De Magnete, he entered the annals of science. Few men of his age bridged such disparate worlds with such integrity. Gilbert's boldest moment came when he declared, "Magnus magnus ipsa est globus terrestris." The earth itself is a great magnet. With those words, he gave the planet agency, power, and hidden structure. He replaced myth with model, speculation with experiment. For sailors, this meant trust in their compass. For philosophers, it meant trust in the method of testing. The courage of that declaration cannot be overstated. To claim that Earth possessed its own force, invisible yet measurable, was to move beyond Aristotle, beyond Ptolemy, beyond centuries of tradition. It was to set science on a new foundation. His coining of the term electricus may seem small compared to the dazzling experiments of later centuries, but language matters. To name is to bring into being. By distinguishing electricity from magnetism, Gilbert created a conceptual space that allowed future generations to explore it as a separate science. Without his word, the chain of discovery, from Guericke's sparks to Franklin's kite to Volta's pile, might have taken longer to unfold. Many of his contemporaries doubted him. Some dismissed the Earth as magnet theory as fanciful, others mocked his magnetic spirit as metaphysical. Yet the enduring test of science is replication, and Gilbert's experiments could be repeated. His Torella model, his compass studies, his rejection of garlic myths, these were demonstrations anyone could try. That replicability was his greatest shield against skepticism and the reason his influence endured. From Gilbert's experiments flowed a lineage of revolution. Kepler, inspired by magnetism, imagined forces driving planets. Newton, inheriting the concept of unseen forces, unified them into universal gravitation. Faraday, a true spiritual descendant, expanded electricity and magnetism into electromagnetism, powering the modern world. Gilbert's place in this chain is not as the final link, but as the beginning. He struck the spark, and others lit the fire. More than electricity or magnetism, Gilbert's greatest legacy is method. He mocked superstition, tested tradition, recorded results, and trusted experiment over authority. In doing so, he became one of the first true practitioners of modern science. If science is a torch carried through generations, passed from hand to hand, illuminating the darkness, then Gilbert was one of its earliest bearers in the modern age. His light was brief but bright, and it showed the path others would follow. So, was William Gilbert the father of electricity? Perhaps not in the sense of Franklin, Volta, or Faraday. Was he the father of magnetism? Without question. But above all, he was a pioneer of science itself, a man who stood at the crossroads of medicine and natural philosophy, and who chose the path of experiment. In a world still bound by superstition, Gilbert believed in the power of evidence. In an age still ruled by authority, he trusted the compass needle, the lodestone sphere, and the rubbed amber. His legacy is not only in what he discovered, but in how he discovered it. And in that sense, William Gilbert was indeed a father not of one science, but of a way of knowing, a way of seeing, a way of daring to ask, what if the truth is hidden not in books, but in nature itself? We began with a question. Was William Gilbert truly the father of electricity? After walking through his life, from Colchester to Cambridge, from Elizabeth's court to the pages of De Magneti, the answer is clearer, though no less profound. Gilbert was not the father of electricity in the modern technological sense. He did not capture lightning like Franklin, nor create a battery like Volta, nor weave the fields of electromagnetism like Faraday. But he did something perhaps more radical. He gave electricity its birth as a science. He named it, distinguished it, and rescued it from the shadows of curiosity. In magnetism, he offered the bold vision that Earth itself is a great magnet. In electricity, he offered the first word, the first classification, the first step. To be a pioneer is not to finish the journey, but to make it possible for others to begin. So, was William Gilbert the father of electricity? Yes, if fatherhood means opening the door, lighting the torch, and daring to declare that what others saw as wonder and superstition was instead a force of nature, waiting to be understood. And in that courage, Gilbert earns his place not just as the father of electricity or magnetism, but as one of the first true fathers of modern science itself.